In the annals of air-to-air combat, there have been several aircraft rivalries that have practically become legend. The Fokker triplane and the Sopwith Camel over the trenches of the First World War. The Bf-109 and the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. The Zero and the Hellcat over the vastness of the Pacific. And the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15 over the mountains of Korea. The latter duo gets a lot of attention because the two aircraft were the first jets to be pitted consistently against one another, clawing for advantage as their respective design companies continued to develop the aircraft to try to maintain advantage during the combat. But it was close to not being these two aircraft. Indeed, an argument could be made that the greatest rival to the MiG-15 was not an American aircraft at all, but a rival from another Soviet builder, the Lavochkin La-15. The origins of this aircraft, indeed of all of the early Soviet jets, was in a demand issued by Stalin in February 1945 that the Soviet Air Force be equipped with jet fighters as soon as possible, a reaction no doubt to the Germans' fielding of the formidable Me-262. This order received a substantial boost when the war finally ended, primarily because of how it did end, which left the Soviet Union in a bit of a bind militarily. Their army had never been stronger. It was bigger, better equipped, and arguably more experienced than any other ground force in the world. On top of that, it was flush with success, responsible, certainly in their own eyes, for defeating the evils of Nazism practically single-handed. But it was also, oddly, now essentially obsolete. The American possession of the atomic bomb, the hideous effectiveness of which had been demonstrated so graphically on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, meant that the Soviets' huge conventional military power was now unable to protect the sacred motherland. The Soviets weren't going to let this state of affairs continue very long, and threw every effort they could into acquiring their own atomic weapon. But they also recognized that they needed better interceptors if they were to have the slightest hope of protecting themselves from the possibility of American bombers bringing utter devastation to their cities. And fortunately for them, they got their hands on a new technology that they could use to make this reality: jet engines. At the end of the war, the Soviets had managed to grab a mass of scientific data, working engines, and German experts, which meant they could soon get their first generations of jet power plants into service. Unfortunately, the two engines that the Soviets rushed into production, the RD-10, a copy of the Humo 004, and the RD-20, a copy of the BMW 003, were mediocre at best. I mean, they were first-generation jet engines, so that was to be expected, but it was obvious that their low power and extremely high rate of wear would mean they were going to be obsolete in short order. Nonetheless, they were what was available, and so the Soviet design bureaus rapidly turned out jet fighters. These were rather primitive affairs, again understandably, with the Yakovlev Yak-15 being essentially a Yak-3 piston engine fighter hastily redesigned to have a jet engine, while the MiG-9, while better, was still recognized as being completely insufficient. However, these early types provided critical experience in building and operating jet aircraft, and the design bureaus rapidly moved on to the next sets of designs, now also employing the knowledge of the captured German scientists who had been working on cutting-edge airframe developments when the war had ended. And it wasn't just Yak and MiG doing this. The Lavochkin Design Bureau had produced some of the best fighters of the entire war in their LA series, which by the beginning of 1943 were becoming the mainstay of the Soviet Air Force's fighter squadrons. However, though they jumped at Stalin's order to develop jet fighters, just as everyone else had, their first attempts were definitely on the clunky side. First, there was the LA-150, which used a similar design philosophy to the MiG-9. This proved pretty poor, and so was quickly followed by the LA-152, which was very similar to the Yak-15. Again, this proved a very limited design and was passed over for the Yakovlev aircraft. It was also becoming apparent that more could be achieved by applying different design philosophies, mainly around the captured German data and expertise on transonic flight. In 1946, Lavochkin developed the Soviets' first swept-wing fighter design, the La-160. First flying in June 1947, this aircraft was to provide the Soviets with their own experience in designing and operating swept-wing aircraft. And though it was essentially an experimental research type, the aircraft was armed with two 37mm cannon, showing the Soviet determination to get a heavily armed bomber interceptor into service as soon as possible. But while the Soviets were rapidly moving ahead with their research into aircraft design, they still faced the key problem of lack of a decent engine. The two former German designs they operated had lifespans of just 25 hours of operation, and though the Soviets had managed to squeeze some extra thrust out of them, it was obvious that the RD-10 and 20 were at the end of their development. And here the Soviets received an unexpected boon, because the British agreed to sell them two of their designs, the Derwent and the Neen. Now, I have a whole video on the reasoning behind this seemingly inexplicable decision, which I shall link to at the end. But spoiler alert, the Brits' reasoning was backed up by several factors, most notable that the engines they sold were themselves considered old tech, and they didn't think the Soviets would be able to copy them. Unfortunately, the reality was that the new engines were an absolute godsend for the Soviet military jet program, finally giving them powerful and reliable engines that could fully exploit the new ideas that the Soviet design bureaus were exploring in transonic aircraft. As soon as examples of the British turbojets were secured, orders were issued to produce the next series of jet fighters. These were to have an armament of at least three 23mm cannon and a top speed of between 621 and 634 miles per hour. In fact, Yakovlev again stole the march on their rival bureaus by basically cheating and ignoring the specification. Their Yak-23 was a development of their existing designs but using the new engine, and though reportedly a pretty good aircraft, was obviously just another incremental stepping stone towards what the Soviet Air Force really wanted: a proper and efficient swept-wing transonic fighter interceptor. And for this, there were only two design bureaus in the run-in, MiG and Lavochkin. In fact, Lavochkin had two designs they were working on. The first of these was the La-168. This employed a copy of the Rolls-Royce Neen, the Klimov RD-45, the same engine that would be used in the rival MiG-15, and which generated 5,000 pounds of force. But due to concerns over whether the Soviet engine builders could replicate the complex metallurgy of the Neen, it was thought prudent to produce a backup design which used the simpler and less powerful Klimov RD-500, which only generated 3,500 pounds of force, and was an unlicensed copy of the Rolls-Royce Derwent as used on the Meteor. Naturally, this meant some compromises had to be made, and the backup aircraft, the La-174, was smaller and about 16% lighter, omitting the big 37mm cannon of the La-168 and limiting armament to three of the new NS-23 23mm cannon, which, to be fair, was plenty of firepower. And though it was an insurance design, the new aircraft was chosen for a limited production run, entering service in 1949 and receiving the official Air Force designation of La-15. While at a glance the aircraft may look similar to the MiG-15, there are some notable differences. The wing was high-mounted compared to the MiG's mid-mount, and the horizontal stabilizer was also set higher up. Because of the high wing, the La-15 utilised an undercarriage that retracted into the fuselage, standard feature with Lavochkin jet designs. In terms of performance, despite its weaker engine, the La-15 was certainly no slouch. Comparative fly-offs against the first MiG-15s showed it was fractionally slower, clocking a top speed at 10,000 feet of 638 miles per hour versus the early MiG-15's 641 miles per hour. It also had an inferior climb rate, with climb to 16,000 feet taking 3 minutes, while the MiG-15 could get there in 2 minutes and 20 seconds. However, the MiG-15 was always recognised as having an exceptional climb rate, and the La-15's was only marginally behind its closest foreign contemporary, the North American F-86A Sabre. Plus, the La-15 was indisputably a better handling aircraft than the MiG, especially at speed, and was more manoeuvrable, with pilots praising the aircraft for its smoothness and agility. In fact, it is quite remarkable when you think about it, how the Soviets went from having practically no jet fighter program in 1945 to producing two literally world-class fighters in 4 years. Because if the La-15 had been developed by pretty much any other nation, it is most likely it would have seen service as that country's primary fighter, because it was, quite frankly, a damn good aircraft. Compared to foreign rivals that used the same basic engine, the original Derwent, it was far superior. And in fact, the Soviets did put it into production. It even got a NATO designation, Fantail. But the Soviets only built 235 of them. Compared to many fighter aircraft, that would be a respectable enough number. Except they built more than 13,000 MiG-15s in the Soviet Union alone, plus thousands more in other countries under license. Against that figure, the Fantail was very much and also ran. So what went wrong? Why did the MiG-15 go on to become legend and the La-15 disappear? For starters, the engine did have issues, notably occasionally flaming out at altitude. But it was also, like the previous German origin engines, a dead duck development-wise, and obviously the future, at least for the Soviets, was in their home-built and more powerful derivative of the Rolls-Royce Nene, the Klimov VK1. But there was in fact another bigger problem for the La-15 when compared to the MiG. It was much more complex to make, utilising a number of very precise and specialised components in its manufacture that made it much more labour intensive than its rival. And for the Soviets, fresh from their experience of World War II, where huge production had been their critical strategic advantage, that was a decisive factor. And that ultimately spelt the end of the La-15. The comparatively few built served in Soviet fighter regiments until 1953 and were then broken up, with many of the components going on to be used in the early anti-ship missiles, which is all a bit of a shame, but understandable, considering the sheer quantities of its hugely successful rival.